Hi, everyone. And so since we're appears to be slowly returning back to a normal state of affairs with the pandemic, I have to use up all of my little microphone protector I have sitting in my office. I'm going to use because I'll never use them again after the next couple of weeks. But all right. Hi. So I'm meeting with some of you in my office, as you know, starting after this class. So again, just to, in case you haven't, for whatever reason, signed up for a conference session, just to show you under Drive, you go to, this is my Google account. And so you should all have received that, that invitation to sign up for a conference. So as you can see, so let me go here to the share screen, and you can see that Ella, Sarah, Anais, and Dewak are going to come to my office today to talk about their midterm papers and my comments that I wrote on those papers. And so the midterm papers have been interesting. I want to make them intriguing and interesting for our students. And I thought, if you write the midterm as if you're preparing to prepare an official document from Catholic University of Korea, either as a brochure to be published electronically or on hard copy, or as a website, for example. All of these official documents of any institution, whether it be Catholic University of Korea or Samsung or Hyundai or whatever, each word has to be approved by the administrators, by the executive directors of the organization. And of course, we are in a very competitive environment in which we're all competing for a business, for market share. That's a theme that needs to be kept in mind when you're reading the Trompenaars and Hampton Turner book. And also for universities, even though universities are typically not for profit, still it's a very competitive environment for everybody, particularly universities in places like Korea, but also in the United States and in Europe, where you have aging population, declining growth in population, fewer and fewer college-age students. So it's an issue everywhere. And to compete for students, to get students to come to your university. And so, so that means also that these public documents are also promoting the university, and at the same time that they're providing useful information. But I did want you in those midterm papers to explain to me why you're including certain statements and sentences and information and advice in that draft brochure or draft website, explaining why you are having that piece of information in that statement, because brochures or websites, they're limited. They have to be limited in size. So every word that you put in there, you choose explicitly put that in there and to exclude something else. And I wanted you also to explain why you had all of that information. You can put the explanation in footnotes in your draft document if you want to make a speech or brochure, but also use and cite specific information from the first 12 chapters of the Trompenaars and Hampton Turner book, and the first 2 chapters of the Cresswell and Poth book, in terms of explaining why you're having that information and why you think it's important to have that statement and not something else. And some of you, I think, did an interesting job of highlighting, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic in your statement. That you pointed out to, for example, as I said in the instructions, you have students coming from the United States, Cambodia, France, other countries coming to the United States. In the United States, wearing masks like I'm doing now is a controversial topic. It's a controversial issue. And I'm going to stand up here because that camera doesn't want to move unless it doesn't want to focus on me unless it sees some movement. So the wearing of masks is a controversial topic in the United States, for good or bad. And so you might want to point out that if an American student is coming to the South Korea to study that that they should expect that they're going to be expected to wear a mask, and they really don't have a choice in the matter, like they do in the United States. Why is that difference? Why is it important to point that out to Americans? Why is it important to point out to American students that Koreans are more likely to obey government directives, at least initially, compared to the United States? I mean, this COVID-19 pandemic has really revealed or indicated these significance of these cultural differences in, for example, many aspects of what I like to call the policymaking process, like particularly how you, as the leader of the United States or an American leader or a Korean leader, appeal to your people to do what you want them to do, to exercise your authority. You still have to justify your authority. You still have to justify your request. You still have to gain acceptance or acquiescence from the public to your request. And obviously, there are different ways rhetorically in terms of public appeals that you do in the United States that differ from how you do it in Korea or Japan or China. And those are cultural differences. Culture in the forms of values and norms that Trompenaars and Hampton-Turner highlight. Norms are what we ought to do. Values are what we like to do. And typically, when you're appealing to people to change the way they behave, like wear a mask all the time, if you're going to appeal to the Americans to change their behavior to why they should wear a mask, you're going to have to explain it rhetorically in terms of ethical appeals. That's what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is about appealing to people's sense of right and wrong, morality. You have to use American romantic self-images of what it means to be the perfect American as a stereotype that exists in people's brains, and all this is a stereotype, to explain to them or try to appeal to them how wearing a mask is what a good American does. And you might say wearing a mask will keep you out of the hospital, so that other people who are old and sick, if they need to go to the hospital, they can, because we don't want the hospitals to be overwhelmed, for example. It may or may not work. It's been very controversial in the United States. And as mentioned before, the United States, by some measures, has, well, depending on how you evaluate it, the United States has done worse than other developed countries in responding to the pandemic. Although how you know what is worse or not depends upon what you value. I mean, someone might point out that there's been 1 million deaths in the United States from COVID-19. But someone who's a strong Trump supporter might say that that's not a valid statistic, right? Those people who died, for the most part, they didn't get vaccinated. They chose not to get vaccinated. Now, that was their choice. So I don't want to hear about 1 million people dying from COVID as somehow meaning that the American response was bad, because we Americans, in this stereotypical romantic self-image, we favor personal liberty first, and we will defend our personal freedoms and liberty above all else. And so this is the kind of politicization that we talk about regarding mask wearing and COVID-19 social distancing requirements. And that's not really discussed in the Trompenaars and Hampton-Turner book in terms of how these cultural norms and values have to be expressed in terms of symbols in the form of rhetorical appeals to the people, to the public, to persuade them to act in a certain way. And that, of course, involves the manipulation of romantic, stereotypical self-images of what it means to be a good Korean, a good Chinese, a good American, a good Russian, whatever. And that's what I've been focusing on in terms of developing some of the ideas and notions, using my ideas and notions, using the Trompenaars and Hampton-Turner material. So, then let's go back to the tier for the week. So we can go back and continue with the Trompenaars Hampton Turner work, but also, okay, yes, now I've almost forgot to do the smart attendance. So we need to do the smart attendance. So we go here again to Chrome, and then we go to www.cuk.ac.kr, and then close this out, make it English, and then go to Cyber Campus, log in, and let me make sure that you can see my screen. And we go to like this, and log in, and then we go to methodology, and then we go to attendance, and we go, here we are in week 8, add smart attendance, and your number is 266. 266 is your smart attendance number. So we go to 266. Let me type that into chat. Chatting 266. 266. Okay. There you go. 266. Okay. So let's and then go back to the share screen and go back to the vote. Let's do a vote. Well, let's consider doing a vote first to get us thinking about these topics. So I keep forgetting to do some of these exercises, or we keep delaying doing some of these exercises because we do other things instead. But maybe it's time to catch up on some of these notions that we're covering here in the class. Oh, by the way, I did ask you to let me know if you found 2 people to interview by today. So please send me an email, or you can even approach me. Although, like I said, I've got something, I start meeting with people after this class. So, but if you found 2 people, please let me know that you found 2 people who agreed to let you interview them. And if they're going to allow you also to record their answers to your questions, if they're going to let you record them, you can either do, as I said, through your smartphone, or try to do it through Zoom, in which case they don't have to be next to you, obviously, to interview them, because you can do it over Zoom. But let me know if there are some issues about people kind of resisting having themselves recorded if you do an interview. Hopefully you can find people that will agree to allow you to interview them. And let me go then to the, again, this notion of romantic notions of what it means to be American or Japanese or Chinese or Korean or Cambodian or French. That's a point made in the Trompenaars and Hampton Turner book, that these are starting points. Of course, Americans have this romantic, stereotypical self-image of the rugged individualist cowboy who only, has to deal with problems by taking care of himself, right? The rugged individualist on the frontier, taking care of his own affairs, doesn't need a big government to take care of himself. That's the romantic image that Americans have in their individualism and their focus on taking care of themselves rather than obligations to groups, whether it be a family or other groups. And Trompenaars and Hampton Turner says these are just starting points. And because all societies, including American society and Korean society, they have elements of the other end of the continuum between individualism and communitarianism. And some of you talked about communitarianism in your essays. And you have that in the United States too, particularly when talking about, for example, national security. That the Americans will, for example, be more willing to obey the demands of the group if the Americans are persuaded that it's necessary in order to fight an evil foreign enemy. And that's maybe good or bad, but it's a fact that one way by which to try to persuade Americans that they should get vaccinated and wear masks is because one dangerous way to try to persuade them is to claim that it's some kind of product of an evil Chinese design to undermine and weaken American society. And Donald Trump played with that, right? He talked about the Wuhan virus and the Kung flu and the Chinese virus. Very dangerous, but that is one way by which you can persuade Americans to act in a communitarian fashion. And that is dangerous because it motivates American politicians to try to manufacture foreign enemies, to look for foreign enemies, to create them, to portray them as being there because they want to win their own domestic political battles, persuade Americans to obey and behave in the way they want them to behave. For example, in getting vaccinated and trying to control the virus. But it's true in all societies, even in communitarian societies, that there are strong individualistic components. And you highlighted that at a recent class, right? I pointed to an article in the news about how Koreans have the highest use of plastic surgery services in the world. That Koreans extensively use plastic surgery services. And someone might say, well, that's clearly evidence that Koreans are interdirected. I mean, they don't just adapt to the environment, they try to change the environment. They try to change what they have through human intervention, through plastic surgery, to change the shape of their face and their bodies, changing what God gave them. Isn't this evidence of interdirected control over nature focus? And some of you pointed out, well, you can argue that at the beginning, but really it serves this orientation that Koreans have to obeying and conforming to collectivist Korean notions of what it means to be beautiful. And this is more powerful in Korea than it might be, for example, in the United States. And so it's very interdirected control focused to conform to communitarian pressures and notions of what beauty looks like in Korea or handsomeness looks like in Korea. And then after we had that talk, I saw this most recent article was published in the New York Times regarding Japan. And this has gotten a lot of coverage in the New York Times, more than just one day's coverage of a popular news program, not news program, reality show television program in Japan called Old Enough. And it highlights how in Japanese culture, there's this expectation, and I don't know, Koreans also show this, about how children are expected to develop autonomous individual capabilities to take care of themselves from a very young age. So this is the name of the program, Old Enough. I think you're seeing that. Let me make sure that I'm sharing the screen. That states here Old Enough is a Japanese show that, is a Japanese show that has been around on the air for decades. Recently came to Netflix. It's on Netflix, so that's okay. That's why Americans know about it now, because it's on international internet streaming service Netflix. It features toddlers running errands without adult supervision. So these 3-year-old Yuka steps off the curb into a crosswalk that bisects a 4-lane street. Even though the light's green, the narrator says in a voiceover, she still looks out for cars. So begins a typical scene in Old Enough, a Japanese reality show that began streaming on Netflix in late March. It is new to American viewers, but has been running in Japan for more than 3 decades, more than 30 years. The show's popularity in Japan is a reflection of the country's high level of public safety, as well as parenting culture that sees toddlers' independence as a key marker of their development. I mean, and the story goes on, the report goes on to describe these amazing things that these toddlers, these young children are expected to do on their own. It is a typical way of raising children in Japan and symbolic of our cultural approach, which can be surprising for people from other countries, said Toshioki Shiomi, an expert on child development and a professor emeritus at Shirome Gaikun University in Tokyo. And so it gives you some background. It started off in 1977, children's book about a mother who sends her 5-year-old daughter out to buy milk for a younger sibling. And it says that these are edited for Netflix. They're around 15 minutes long, these episodes. They track toddlers as young as 2 years old as they attempt to run errands in public for the first time, with the studio audience laughing in the background. Safety spotters and camera crews hide off screen with mixed results. They often stumble into the frame. It says here, as the children navigate crosswalks in public places full of adults, a narrator describes their incremental progress in breathless tones, like a commentator calling a baseball game in the 9th inning. And the toddlers strike up conversations with the strangers they meet along the way. And so these are 2, 3, 4-year-old children being sent out to go buy milk on their own, out into the city to go to the store and buy things, something Americans would never do. They would never send their 3-year-old child to go to the 7-Eleven and buy some milk. They would never do that, right? They said it's crazy. Mom said, instead of her, I would go to the shops today. 3-year-old Yuka tells the shopkeeper in the coastal city of Akashi she buys udon noodles for a family meal. Really, the shopkeeper replies, aren't you a clever thing? And of course, they have problems. Of course, and it's all very funny, and as people watch this, when a 2-year-old, another case, when a 2-year-old Io's father, a sushi chef, asks him to take home some soy sauce stained chips whites to a nearby laundromat, he won't budge. So he asks his 2-year-old child to take his laundry to the laundromat. So it goes on here. I won't cover the whole point, but just to show you how, we have this notion of Japanese culture, for example, being very communitarian and not emphasizing individualism and the focus on the individual taking initiative on their own. But here you see, in terms of raising young children, Japanese at a very, very young age will send their children out to do autonomous tasks independently when they're barely able to walk out onto the street to go to stores where there's cars and traffic. Professor Shomi said the parents in Japan try to instill a particular kind of self-sufficiency in their children. In Japanese culture, independence doesn't mean arguing with others or expressing oneself, he said. It means, in other words, it's not like America. It means adapting yourself to the group while managing daily tasks, such as cooking, doing errands, and greeting others. And so this has captured American attention because now it's on American television. So, and it's surprising to American readers to read something like this if they don't have an experience with Japanese culture. So I just thought I should point that out because that just came out yesterday, this news report. Okay, and then this is a news report from a few years back about how American society changes. That's an issue in the Trump and Ars Hampton Turner book. Yeah. Oh, screen share. Okay, thank you. Here. In terms of warning or indicating that America is changing and becoming a more atomistic culture than it already is, there has been a lot of focus on the work of this professor, this political science professor named Robert Putnam, who wrote a book that was published when I was in graduate school called Bowling Alone, which is the massive landmark work. When I was a young child, my father, he was an Italian immigrant, right? So he worked hard. He worked very hard in construction. And then every Tuesday night, he would go to the bowling alley and join a bowling league. And that would be a place where they would meet other people and talk about the world current events and local community affairs and get to know each other. And this is declining and declining and declining, particularly since the American manufacturing economy began to experience deep declines in the 1970s and 80s, because Americans are now doing more service work in the service sector, in retail, and also working more hours and having to work more jobs because they don't make enough money to take care of their family simply by having one job, the way most Americans did when I was a small child. And so this notion that people are now no longer engaged in as much civil society activity, like joining a bowling league or a golfing league or going to clubs, like the big Catholic civil society organization that I used to go to when I was a small child was the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Columbus was a Catholic organization headed by men, and all the families would join, and American Catholics, whether it be Irish or Italian or German, they would meet at the Knights of Columbus Club. And I remember doing that as a small child, and and it would be an opportunity for people to talk and communicate with each other. But this has changed as America's become more unequal with greater inequality within American society, and greater polarization within American society, and describing therefore how Americans are coming to know each other less and less and less, because the only place they interact with each other is at the work site. And then when the work site is over, when they're done working for the day, they go home. This is before the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, when people still had to come into the office to the work for the most part. They're not interacting with each other. Rather, they're watching Netflix or watching TV or playing video games. And there has been some response to this that maybe Putnam was overstating the extent to which social media, or underestimates the extent to which social media provides new connections and new community of people to interact virtually through Facebook and social media platforms. But of course, some of the interaction is not very positive, because they're also forming more polarized in-groups as they find other people that they share their views about, for example, negative stereotypes of certain outgroups, whether it be women or African Americans or Hispanics. So they have more polarization in American society, because it's so easy to communicate with people, almost too easy to communicate with people through social media. This book was written, of course, long before social media emerged, and highlighting how Donald Trump's election somehow is a reflection of this growing separation of Americans from each other, so they're not as familiar with each other as they used to be. And therefore, since they're not as familiar with each other, because they're not interacting with each other socially, personally, face to face, they become fearful of each other. And America is becoming, in a sense, a nation of strangers. And so I was curious as to whether or not you think that's true also in Korea, that South Korea is also increasingly becoming a nation of strangers as well. Of course, this is before the pandemic, and that this is a manifestation of becoming a modern developed society, that these communitarian notions of obligation to others is becoming less and less important. Do you think this overstates this atomization? Again, the election of Donald Trump somehow has been pointed to as evidence that more and more Americans are coming to hate each other, coming to fear each other and dislike each other. And this is somehow connected with the fact that people have less time to get to know each other through personal interaction, and social media is not compensating. In fact, it's making it worse, because you can so easily only interact with people that you like, who are like you on social media, because Facebook will point you in directions to communicate with other people who have the same preferences that you have. And those are the people that you interact with, rather than if you go to the bowling alley and join a bowling league, you've got to deal with lots of different kinds of people. And so do you think South Korea is increasingly becoming a nation of strangers as well? And so I asked you on this exercise how you feel. South Korea is increasingly becoming a nation of strangers as well. Do you agree, strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? And so let me see how you vote here. And I think everybody's already voted. And has the pandemic influenced your thoughts on this at all? Do you see more evidence of charitable interaction with people coming to work together to deal with the problems of the pandemic? Or has the pandemic had positive and negative features in terms of polarization regarding people? So there's some difference here in the class regarding how they're responding to that. Okay, so let's, so finally, I want to make sure, since I set up that exercise, that we got it done, and so it's done. And okay, so let's open up the notes that we started to cover last week, and we made some progress in, but there's a lot in these notes and from chapter 1 and 2 of the Cresswell and Poth book. And this is interesting because this book is your introduction to the philosophy of science. And let me see if I can open up my, did I open up my lesson plan here? Let's open up the lesson plan. As I said, if you go to graduate school and we assume if you go to graduate school in political science that you want to get a PhD, you want to become a professor. And you probably will have to take a class on the philosophy of science and how to do science. And one of the books that you probably will have to read is this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this book is highly controversial, but it is highly, highly influential. And it was published, and why won't it expand to? It's interesting how this won't. Oh, there it is. Okay, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This book came out in 1962 when I was born, and it's still in publication, and it's the author's still around. And this book is really controversial because Thomas Kuhn was, let me make sure you can see this. Thomas Kuhn was highlighting how does knowledge change? How does science change? And Americans, because of their, I hadn't thought about this. This is actually interesting. And this is something that I need to think about more. And again, as a side note, it's one of the benefits of teaching because I learn, because I'm up here trying to formulate my ideas here more clearly. Americans are sequential. You know that in terms of the relationship of Americans to time, they are sequential. He's pointing out in this book that the development of scientific knowledge is not really sequential. It goes through cycles in sequence. So, we have this, particularly these Americans, with this universalistic approach to rules and this belief that, that history is all about progress, from our primitive past to the brighter future, as we can become more prosperous and wealthy and more technologically developed, that history is a history of progress towards a Star Trek type future, right? What he points out in this book in terms of how scientific knowledge develops is that there are revolutions. And the cases that he covers, perhaps the most well-known case is the Copernican theory of the solar system. You know what the Copernican theory of the solar system is? It's named after Nicholas Copernicus, or, Polish nationalists would be very proud to point out that he was a Polish astronomer. And he was the one that argued, I think, in the 15th century, that guess what? The Earth goes around the sun. The sun is not the center of the universe. Rather, the Earth circles the sun, orbits the sun. And why did this notion emerge? What was wrong with the old theories going back to the ancient Greeks that no, the Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets, they all circle the Earth? How did that Copernican notion of the solar system replace the old, I think it's the Ptolemaic, under Ptolemy, the ancient Greek scientist, replace the Ptolemaic theory of the solar system in which the Earth is the center of the solar system? And he points out that Copernicus' notion of the solar system having the sun at the center, not the Earth, was a proposal that emerged at first that produced predictions that were not as accurate as the old existing models of the solar system. That Copernicus's notions that the Earth goes around the sun, he may use math to come up with models to make predictions about what we should see on the basis of his assumption that the sun, not the Earth, the sun is the center of the solar system. Those initial predictions were not as accurate as the old established notions and models using math that predicted that the Earth is the center of the solar system and the sun and the moon all go around the Earth. So why did the Copernicus model replace the Ptolemaic model, the old model that had been dominant for thousands of years? And he doesn't really explain why, but he argues or points out that almost overnight, the entire field of scientists in the 15th and 16th century moved towards the Copernican model of the solar system. And of course, we know about Galileo Galilei, the Italian astronomer, who in the 17th century developed his telescope, and he took images, drew down by hand the images that he saw in the moon, and the moon's going around Jupiter. In the sky, you can see with a small telescope the four moons, the four biggest moons of Jupiter going around Jupiter, giving more and more evidence that guess what? The Earth is not the center of everything. The Earth is not the center of the universe. And on the basis of this preliminary empirical evidence, the entire scientific field rushed to the Copernican model, and the old Ptolemaic model was thrown away like this. Why did that happen? And he says this is how scientific change typically happens. It's not a progress of sequential development of new insights and discoveries, building upon previous insights and discoveries towards the broadening and increasing amount of knowledge, building upon previous knowledge. No, there is a prevailing theory or paradigm in physics or biology or in geology or astronomy that exists, and then there's a revolution in that field. And the old model is destroyed and the new model replaces it in this scientific revolution. And he wants to prove that in this book. So he talks about astronomy, the Copernican revolution. I think he talks about the discovery of oxygen, because I read this book decades ago, right, when I was in graduate school. But more recent ones, like for example, you know, we all understand how earthquakes happen, right? That the plates of the earth float on molten rock, lava, and they're pushing into each other, and this causes volcanoes and earthquakes. But this notion of tectonic plates floating on top of a sea, a deep ocean of molten rock, lava, this notion only emerged at the end of the 19th century. And when it was first proposed, this is an important point. When it was first proposed, it was mocked and ridiculed. Like, what are you proposing? I can't remember who proposed it, but you're proposing that the lands of Europe and Asia and the Americas are a thin crust floating upon a deep, deep well of molten rock, floating around the world and crashing each other. For the people that had been scientists who had built their career in the old established previous models, they resisted and resisted and fought and fought and fought against that. And they fought viciously, like they did with the Copernican revolution. When Galileo Galilei, he published his findings and argued that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth. The Catholic Church threatened to torture and kill him unless he changed his mind and declared he was wrong. They put him on trial and threatened to torture him unless he renounced his arguments, because he was threatening the established order and all of the political interests that were vested in that system that was partly justified by this notion that the earth and human beings are the center of the universe by God's will, and the church, the Catholic Church, represents God's will. So Galileo was put on trial by the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church put Galileo on trial, and they threatened to torture him. And he renounced his findings because he was afraid. But he was right. So this scientific revolution involves intense political combat, attacks, vicious attacks that threaten people's careers, not to mention possibly their lives, in the case of Galileo and other scientists as well, in other fields. So science, social science, including the physical sciences, the hard sciences like physics, these are political communities engaged in a communal collective process that involves struggle and interest shaping the outcome of this scientific process. And as the context in which we live changes through economic development, greater awareness of interdependency, our established paradigms or notions of how the world works come under challenge. And at some point, the old established prevailing notions that characterized science and scientific research, and that were the assumptions that we began with to begin our studies, they come under challenge. And the battle and combat over these revolutions is, it can be intense. And this isn't just a historical case, it's a case today, right? Like maybe the most famous leftist, dissident intellectual in American society today who's still alive is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is in his 90s. He is, in a sense, the father of modern linguistics, linguistic science. His name comes up whenever I attend a linguistics conference on Zoom. And he was the leader of the most recent revolution in linguistic science. And books have been written about how he fought and struggled against the prevailing interests that dominated linguistics up until that time. And the people that lost those battles, those linguistic wars they were described, they went off and they lost their jobs and got some jobs somewhere far away at a minor school, because Noam Chomsky had convinced people that his notions of linguistic theories were better than the old established theories of linguistics. And I know about it because books have been written about the linguistic wars. I think I can find that here on Amazon because those books are still published. But this book from 1962 was the first book to point that out. And like I said, he makes the argument about how science really develops and changes. He doesn't really focus so much on what I'm talking about in terms of how society develops and changes and people become more aware of interdependency. He doesn't talk about that. I mean, he was originally a physicist. He was in physics, and he wrote this book on one of the foundational books of the field of what's called today the history and philosophy of science. The history of philosophy of science. And like I said, everybody who goes to graduate school in political science, they probably have to read this book. It's one of the first books you have to read. And I'm going to find that Noam Chomsky. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah. So This is one of those books about Noam Chomsky's defeat over this person to establish the dominant way of doing linguistics today. And this is in the middle of the 20th century. It's not that long ago, right? And if you go into linguistic studies, you're probably going to have to read this book. And so that's the background for this reading of chapter 1 and 2 in the Cresswell and Poth book. Cresswell obviously knows about Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And what we find that unlike in physics or even in economics, political science and sociology, they tend to have less tendency to orient towards one general paradigm or theory for doing research. In economics today, just about everybody does neoclassical Keynesian macroeconomics. Like John Maynard Keynes, his way of approaching, he created modern economics in a sense. It was John Maynard Keynes that created this notion of inflation rate, gross domestic product, unemployment rate, all of these statistics that we see covered in the news media regarding the unemployment rate or the level of inflation. These were all created by John Maynard Keynes. So in economics, pretty much everybody is engaged in some form of neoclassical economic theory. But in political science and in sociology, there's much more theoretical diversity. And will we ever see one single theoretical general framework dominate in the study of political science? Maybe. I have my views, but the point is made that there is never one single everlasting, permanent right and wrong way for doing engaged in scientific analysis. And our scientific frameworks reflect our cultural biases. That's an important point. And our cultural biases reflect our political interests in which we vest our careers and our identities. And that is, you really confront that, that nature of science when you try to get published as a professor writing articles. I described this process of peer review in a previous class, right? That, if I write a paper, I think the paper is good, I send it to a journal, the editor of the journal reviews my article, and if he thinks or she thinks the journal article that I submit is decent, they will then send that journal article to 2 other political scientist professors and remove my name, and I will not know who they are, and they will not know who I am. And people have very strong opinions about the right and wrong way of doing social science. And they invest themselves and their careers and their identities into that framework. And if they read a journal article that comes from a very different theoretical perspective, they might be very hostile to it. And since their name is hidden, I don't know who they are, and they don't know who I am, they can be really nasty in the peer review process. They take it personally. The differences in which we bring our different viewpoints and how to do social science become very conflictual. And so that's why it's important to cover these different philosophical assumptions and interpretive frameworks, that you should know that in qualitative research, that qualitative research tends to be more progressive and oriented towards challenging the status quo. And partly for this reason, there has been more and more journals created over the years reflecting these different theoretical perspectives, because if I send my article my job depends upon success in getting published. And it seems like so much of whether or not I'm successful in getting published, so much depends upon chance. Who was the anonymous unknown person who was selected to review my article? I don't know. Are they like me, or are they something completely different in terms of their theoretical background? You don't know. So for that reason, there are more and more different kinds of journals that describe themselves as being feminist or neo-Marxist, or, you know, according to those frameworks that we covered briefly in this chapter earlier, right? So the researcher as a multicultural subject, in terms of our history and research tradition, is important. Our conceptions of self and the other, these are all important. The ethics and politics of research, and these are affected by society, right? And society changes and evolves. The way medieval society changed and evolved to make more and more people receptive to this notion that maybe we need to change our fundamental understanding of human relations to the world, that human beings and God are not the center of the universe, that maybe there's something else going on in the world, as reflecting the fact that the sun is the center around which humanity revolves, rather than all of creation, God's creation, revolving around humanity. I mean, it's really a revolutionary notion when you think about it. Or maybe the most influential thinker of modern times is Charles Darwin, right? Charles Darwin, 200 years ago or 180 years ago, developing his theory of evolution. Think about the shock that made to the world, in which people believe that God made everything. God made me, God made CUK, God made this universe, God made this world, God made all the plants, all the animals, all the insects, all the fish. And then Charles Darwin says, no, there's a process of environmental selection, natural selection going on that's creating and producing biological diversity. I mean, that's still to this day, many, many people in America reject the theory of evolution. Why did his theory of evolution become attractive? Why did more and more people agree to it? Of course, as I told you, when Copernicus was developing his theories, his models were less accurate in predicting the movements of the sun and the planets around the sky than the old established Ptolemaic models. But the Ptolemaic models were becoming more and more and more complicated, incredibly complicated, to try to predict accurately the movements that we see in the sky of the planets, of the stars, of the moon, of the sun. But they were more accurate at first than Copernicus' model. But that very fact that they're becoming more and more elaborate and complicated, oh my God, people are saying, we've got to start from a new framework. And you know what? We don't need to start with the view of the Catholic Church that humanity and God made humanity the center of the universe. We don't have to start with that. And why did they start with that? What was going on? People could see that the world was changing. More and more people, not everybody, but more and more people could see that human beings were changing the world around them, the political world, the religious world. You know, at the same time, we start to have the Protestant Reformation begins. With forerunners to Martin Luther, but there were these awarenesses emerging that what we have always been told can be challenged. It's not necessarily true. So that's why it's important to keep in mind where we are, who we are, as students or professors in 2022 at the Catholic University of Korea, in East Asia with a rising China, declining United States, and developing society, social movements challenging the status quo, philosophical assumptions. You can see some of the different theoretical frameworks. These are categories, and of course, this, as I mentioned, has become a big political topic of dispute in politics in America today, teaching critical race theory in American schools, research strategies derived from that, methods and collection of analysis, observing, interviewing, so on, oral histories, focus groups. You can see focus groups here, applied ethnographies. These are methods of collection and analysis, and the art, practice, and politics of interpretation and evaluation. So speaking of focus groups, let me show you something that came up in the New York Times a couple days ago. And this topic is interesting because it's also relevant for understanding politics in Korea, right? The new president of South Korea is a conservative. According to American media reports, one of the big, share screen. One of the big media, according to what American media reports, one of the big topics of controversy in Korean politics in the presidential election was how would I phrase this in Korean terms? The rights of what we call affirmative action in the United States. Affirmative action is action to break the status quo in which there is systemic marginalization of traditionally inferior groups. Affirmative action, take action that changes, affirmatively changes society by providing more opportunities for women, for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for gay people to acquire positions in organizations, in business, in government, in universities, and undermining the traditional notions of what it means to be a successful business person, or what you need to do to be considered most skilled and most qualified to reach the highest levels in business or government, to smash the glass ceiling, right? That's the ceiling. This notion that, for example, in a world dominated by traditional masculine notions of leadership, that women can never rise to the highest level, have greater difficulty rising to the highest levels in an organization, because that organization is still implicitly dominated by traditional notions that the best leader is a masculine male type person, showing masculine male type military leadership skills. And this apparently was a big topic in the Korean presidential election, right? So, and of course, it also reflects discussions going on in the United States as well. And this is an example of a focus group that the New York Times, which is considered to be, the New York Times is a left of center, postmodern, pragmatic newspaper. It's not really radical. It's chicly liberal. And so this is an example of a focus group. And this person, Kristen Soltis Anderson, was hired by the New York Times to create a focus group of 8 conservative American men to really try to find out what's going on in the minds of conservative white, well, not, these aren't white, some of them are, a couple of them are not white, these 8 men, as to why they support conservative political leadership. They might be Trump supporters, intense Trump supporters. And so here's an example of a focus group trying to go deeply into the thinking of these 8 individuals to find out what really is motivating their conservative political militancy, their support for Trump and Trump-like figures. And what she finds in this focus group, that what appears to be a primary motivator for this conservative movement in the United States is this attack on traditional, this undermining of traditional American notions of what it means to be a good man. that somehow they feel under attack, these 8 men, for being men, that they're somehow bad because they are traditional in their understandings of the relationship of men and women. And so I just want to go through this to show you an example of a focus group. It says here, there was no talk of a stolen election, no conspiracy theories about voter fraud or rants about President Biden's legitimacy, because Donald Trump always claims that the election was stolen from him. Yet listening to our 90-minute focus group with 8 conservative men, you couldn't help but worry for our democracy a bit. I mean, Donald Trump is probably going to run again for president in 2024. The men didn't see themselves fitting into American society today. They didn't feel free to be themselves in the culture. 7 of them said they felt like a stranger in their own country. At a time when democratic institutions are under pressure and even under attack, the United States feels so ununited. What causes these Americans to feel so alienated from America? After recent focus groups with Democratic-leaning voters on the economy, younger women on work, relationships and gender roles, and teenagers on school and their futures, we decided to talk to conservative men about how they see themselves and what they value. Most said they believe society is headed toward increased rule breaking and a me culture. Crime and a sense of lawlessness came up a lot. Our focus group leader, Kristen Soltis Anderson, was surprised by how much they used examples of poor road etiquette as emblematic of broader societal decay, the way people behave when they drive. To that end, safety was a major theme, concern about being physically attacked and also concern about being verbally attacked for what they say. Several felt that the cost of saying what they think is really sometimes just not worth it. Maybe it's better to go like this. Evoking worries among some Americans about free speech and cancel culture. And they had strong views about masculinity and gender. They seemed aware that their views are out of step with modern culture and will offend some, but still felt their views were obviously correct. And it goes on to highlight, this is the 7th group in our America in Focus, which seeks to hear and understand the views of cross sections of Americans whose voices are often not heard in opinion journalism. We conducted a discussion with Ms. Anderson, who does similar work for political candidates, parties, and special interest groups. So Ms. Anderson, she was paid for her work. So she's a professional qualitative researcher. This Kristen Soltis Anderson, she is an expert in qualitative research. She does this for political candidates in creating political campaigns for these candidates. What do we need to say and do to get people to vote for us, right? Through this kind of focus group research. She does research for parties and special interest groups. And you can see as she goes through these, asks these questions, she's not directly asking these 8 men about masculinity and gender. Only later in the interview, only later in her interview questions to these 8 men, after they bring up or indicate through their responses to her general probing questions, they indicate that masculinity and being under attack for having traditional notions of what it means to be a good man in America. Does she then bring it up in her questions towards the end of this interview? So you have to be careful when you do your research, when you interview your interviewees in your research project, that you make sure as they are describing the challenges they face in Korea, that you're not asking them questions that will give you the answers you want to hear. Your backgrounds will shape the kind of research questions you ask and what interests you and motivates you to do this research, but you have to try to highlight and control your own personal preferences to make sure you are not incentivizing the people you are interviewing to say what you want them to say. So she's very careful about this. And again, just to jump ahead, this research focus group indicates that these questions of gender roles and gender identity and the proper way to act in American society is a critical factor, an important factor at least, explaining the rise of conservative populist Trumpism or conservative populist reactionary political behavior. So just to start off, see, look at the kind of question she asks. Kirsten Soltis Anderson asks this question: if you had to describe your biggest concern about the United States or American society in a single word or phrase, what would it be? And so Tony, she doesn't give their last name, white, retired, 72, government spending. Derek, you have a black man, 63, software engineer, so he's got a college degree. Inflation. Michael, economy. Christopher. So this also you need to do when you do your research. When you do your own research projects, you have to have autobiographical information. You have to have biographical information about your interviewee. You have to keep their name, keep them anonymous. I'm not supposed to know who they are. You can give them fake names, but you do have to record who they are, what age they are, where they're from, obviously, what they are studying, all the information you think is important for understanding what it means to be, what drives these individuals to choose to come to South Korea and study for 6 months or a year when they could have gone anywhere else. They don't have to come to South Korea. Why did they choose to come to South Korea to study? To go on, Christopher, black, not another black person, small business loan broker. Again, somebody who's involved in the private sector. Elitism. Danny, Middle Eastern, his job as a realtor. Again, a small business person. Florida, disgraceful. Joe, white, 37, apparel manufacturing, New York, weak. And so then the focus group leader, this researcher asks this question to Joe. Joe, why weak? And then Joe starts talking. This is not the America I remember growing up in, and it's just sad to see what's going on. Then she adds, Anderson asks, do you have a particular concern for your own community? Robert, tell me about that. And then Robert responds, crime. And one of the themes that's implied when you get to the end of this report is that these men think that American society is breaking down because we don't have a consensus agreement on what it means to be a consensus agreement on what is good and bad behavior. And that's connected to your identity as a person in society, including your identity as a man or a woman. And so she goes on to encourage more feedback because she's trying to get data. You want to get people to talk. You want to get people to give you their feedback, to get as much text as you need in the form of words they give you to be able to look for themes. So again, too much text is always better than too little text. So she's always prodding them to speak more, but without at the same time pointing them in particular directions until it becomes clear that there is a direction that comes up and that she then pursues towards the end of this focus group. People don't get punished for doing right and wrong anymore. We reward mediocrity, so-and-so says. Again, Anderson asks, my next question, how free do you feel to just be yourself in society these days? I'm seeing a lot of people put zeros up. So this person responds, you're not free to be yourself anymore because of crime. You've got to be concerned about, if I go out, am I going to be a victim of crime? So in other words, there is the role of the researcher is important here because the researcher has to interpret what these people are saying, right? That society is breaking down. And society is breaking down because what people want to argue that what they want is good, not just for them, it's good for everybody. That's a fundamental assumption that what I want and advocate for, I'm going to make myself believe that what I want is good, not just for me, it's good for the whole society. And the fact that the society is not doing what I recommend means all of society is suffering. So this person is claiming that society is becoming polarized by crime. Everybody's becoming fearful of being hurt by criminals. And what's the solution for this problem? We need to have an agreement or at least a tolerance for what it means to be a traditional American man. And somehow being a traditional American man is under attack. By who? By feminists, leftists, by radical people who have their own agendas, undermining what is the foundational principles of right and wrong behavior in America. And that's undermining all of American society in the form of crime, more and more crime. So again, these people, they're not social scientists, these interviewees. But you have to interpret what they say with your own theoretical framework that you are bringing with you as the researcher. And this theme that I've brought up repeatedly in my classes, right, is that people tend to see the world in a way that's self-serving, right? So I will argue about how what I want is good, not just for me, it's good for everybody, and it fits with traditional American notions of what is good. And I'm trying to appeal to you as Derek. What does Derek say? Derek, I served in the military. Military, yeah, a veteran. He's a hero. We all love our soldiers. Again, not because he's a bad guy. It's just people do this. You know this from social psychology, from Leon Festinger and Fritz Heider and Sigmund Freud. You bring your own theoretical framework as a researcher to understand these people better than they understand themselves, by far better than they understand themselves, or at least you understand what they're saying in ways that you can interpret. You need to bring a theoretical framework to bear to interpret what they're saying and the significance of what they're saying. So Derek says, I served in the military. He's trying to appeal to you, right? Listen to me. I'm a hero. I was in the military. I came back and I'm living my life. People are going to be what they want to be, and I'm going to be what I want to be. So this libertarian notions, right? You do what you want to do, and I'll do what I want to do. That's what America's all about. Stereotypical romantic notions of American libertarian individualism. Michael, I live in Orlando, and when we moved here, it was a beautiful place. Now, right down the street, people are stealing stuff, breaking into cars, and it's difficult to engage because you're afraid that no matter what you say, somebody's going to take offense to it, even though you may just be wanting to ask a valid question and understand something. Again, this notion of crime, and this, again, you have to be an expert in America. There has been this predisposition to believe that African Americans and Hispanic Americans, that they are predisposed to be criminals. Now, they're not going to come out and admit this, Derek or Michael, but as a researcher, from your understanding of America, because you're an American expert, that there has always been that theme that somehow criminality associates with threatening non-white people, even if it's not true. So Kristen Soltis Anderson goes on, can you think of examples? It's almost anything. You can't mention Trump. You can't mention Biden. Joe, I feel that social media destroyed a lot of the culture that we had. Things used to be private, or perhaps people just said things, and then they get regretted after. Christopher, I'm one of these people that speak against cancel culture. I think that true patriotism is recognizing that regardless of what party you're in, we're all Americans, and we should start with that premise. Then we find more reasons to join together rather than find silly reasons to fight against each other. Like, what's silly? These are sensitive topics because people more or less are aware of they're doing what I already described they're doing. not because they're bad people. It's just human nature. And Joe says, I'm in. Krupa, what about you? He's Asian, so he's not white. He's 22. He's a medical assistant from Maryland. I would say you're not allowed to be free anymore. Due to the internet and social media, a bunch of trolls have gotten so much power. They're constantly out there to play gotcha. So you got to be cautious. So play gotcha, right? You made some kind of comment about women being more emotional than men. You can't say that. Patrick Keeley, for those of you who this has happened to, where you're expressed an opinion and you feel like people have come after you or gotten angry, where does it happen? And so, again, this self-justification, these are conservative men, right? Danny, I've been a realtor for 22 years. I lived in Orlando, Florida for 44 years. I have a pretty damn good reputation. I'm not being arrogant. About a year and a half ago, I was the president of one of the homeowners associations in our community. An Asian woman got into an argument with us. When I say us, I mean the whole board. That night, she went and wrote a review on my business page saying I'm a racist. My parents are Lebanese. I was beaten up every day when I was a kid because I'm Arabic, but I'm born in America. I'm not racist. I love cultures. I love languages. She wrote a nasty review and Google won't take it down, even though she wasn't a client of mine. She'd never bought a house from me. She never did business with me, but she said that I'm a racist. That's what's happening today. And that's never happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And you know what's worse? You can't stop it. So he's not giving you the whole story, obviously. He's giving his perspective on the story. But as a researcher, you understand what's going on, or at least have some alertness to that possibility. Robert, I would agree with Danny. What Danny's saying, people become judge, jury, and executioner. It could be at work, even at church. If you've got a different viewpoint than the other people and you're in the minority, then you could be, what do you call it, bullied. And so Patrick asks Robert, is there something specific that you remember happening? Robert, I voted for Trump. I like Trump from when he was with The Apprentice. I knew him as a business person. I mean, that was a reality show. I guess that Apprentice show, I mean, I wasn't watching it because I've been outside the US. That really made a lot of impact on a lot of people. And again, because of that American romantic stereotype that you know from American culture, what do Americans romanticize as the ideal American? A successful business person. A successful business person, not a successful professor, not a successful politician, the business person. And that's a topic for my American politics class and American history classes. And Donald Trump played with that on The Apprentice, right? He's Mr. Successful, self-made billionaire, even though it's not true. That's how he portrayed himself. The self-made billionaire, the self-made man who was successful in business without government intervention, without assistance. Of course, it's not true, but that's the romantic stereotype that Americans have of themselves. That's why I voted for him. And then, oh Lord, from church to every place, people just had a problem with it. You can't make it have a different viewpoint. And so Christopher is a Black person who supports Trump. I just want to harmonize with what Robert is saying. I don't even know if you guys have heard of this term, but I've been called coon, a nasty word for Black people, and Sambo, in every word in the book. When it came to Trump, everybody's so focused on the sound bites. But when I show them the executive orders that he's done for so many different cultures and peoples that are part of America, they don't want to hear that. They only want to stick to the sound bites. That's when I realized just how irrational so many Americans are. And I blame the huge part of that on the media. So Donald Trump got significantly better percentage of votes in 2020 among Blacks and Hispanics than he got in 2016. And again, from your theoretical background, your theoretical framework, that many of these groups that have been traditionally marginalized, they desperately want to be allowed to be successful in America, to be accepted as Americans, to be respected as Americans after centuries of being viewed and stereotyped negatively. So this is the kind of text you get from these interviews. You don't ask leading direct questions, but you try to get these people to talk so that you can analyze and look for patterns that you then have to use a theoretical framework to interpret. You can't make sense of this unless you have a theoretical framework that you bring to your research. And that means you have to choose a theoretical framework because there's lots of theoretical frameworks out there. Derek, I mean, even before the information age, talking about politics inflamed people. Even before the information age, talking about religion inflamed people. Now you've got access to all this information, to all these different sources. So it's coming at you fast and furious. But for me, the same thing's been happening forever. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you talk about politics, you get into a heated argument. And so yeah, these are not bad guys, these 8 guys. These are typical nice Americans who want to be liked, that want to be responsible. They don't want to offend anybody. How can decent, nice people vote for Trump? Particularly what happened after on January 6, 2001 last year. And so, you know, that they're aware of what happened, obviously, on January 6, 2001 last year, after the election in November 2020. And so that's influencing their behavior as well. And that's influencing their responses, their answers to these questions. Michael, do you think there's any things that in particular you just try not to talk about today? And then Michael says, well, one of the things that I'm sensitive to is diversity. Diversity is when you have people that truly have different ways of thinking. And that's how you solve problems, but you can't talk about it because people don't see it that way. It's all about skin colors, all about sexual orientations, all about these things that the media constantly talks about. It's not about the things that really make us, give us value as individuals. And Joe says, there's a lot of things you really can't talk about. I was mentioning to someone in my office about the president appointing a Supreme Court nominee. It was an African-American woman, this Ketanji Brown Jackson, that just got approved, the first Black woman on the US Supreme Court. And I was saying, that's the most racist thing you can do. What if somebody else was good? What if they were Asian? What if they were anything? And then when you speak to somebody about it, well, what are you, racist? No, I'm not racist. Like, why did Biden go out of his way to nominate a Black woman? Is that what we do in America? That, oh, we're first going to look to make sure that you're Black and you're a woman. Then we'll see how smart you are, how well you've been trained, how wise your decisions have been. Then Kirsten Soltis Anderson asks, are there any places where you do feel comfortable? At home, being yourself? Joe, during the pandemic, we decided to make a WhatsApp group. And that, okay, so now that's interesting, right? Because these guys are not dumb. They know Anderson wants to interview them, but you got to make sure your interviewee, the person you're interviewing, doesn't view you as a threat. That you're somehow judging them when you're interviewing them. So Joe says, during the pandemic, we decided to make a WhatsApp group. And that group grew to what it is today of like 35 guys that mostly share the same views. Right? Because of social media. They're not going to bowling alleys and joining a bowling league. Right? They're getting on social media and just talking to people who share and reflect the same views. And we just talk to each other all day and everybody says what's on their mind. We don't hold back. And then Anderson goes on, then let me then ask the flip side of this question, which is, are there any spaces where you specifically don't feel comfortable? Any places where you are extra on guard? And then Joe indicates, right? I would definitely say in my office. I don't want to offend anybody, and I have 4 kids. I have a living to make. I don't want to deal with any headaches. So 80% of a person's life is their job. Right? 80% of their social interaction, 80% of a person's social interaction is their job. So it looks like Joe because, we want to talk to the people we work with. We want to be friends with them. We want to enjoy being there. He might have said something that got him into trouble. I know I've done it. Right. And he's defensive here. Danny, I've had friends that I've known for 20, 30 years drop me from Facebook over political differences. No matter how well they've known you, they'll turn their back to you. And then you have this response, oh, but I have friends who are totally opposite to me politically, and we're on great terms, okay? And then Anderson asked this question, another show of hands question. How many of you agree with this statement? I feel like a stranger in my own country. All but Derek raised their hands. And then Danny goes on, we are the most selfish, self-centered, entitled culture. Everything is me, me, me. My brother's a doctor in the emergency room. I hear stories every single night. People just run red lights. And when we were younger, we used to see one person run a light. Now it's 4 or 5 cars in a row that are on the same red light. They could literally kill a family. They don't care. They're in a hurry. They've got to get to Chick-fil-A. And so I just wanted to highlight how this is an example of qualitative research. And an example, this person, is hired by the New York Times. So this person must have a really good reputation as a researcher. And she's hired by political campaigns, political parties, and companies and special interest groups that are trying to appeal to American public opinion. And she's trying to get this valuable information from people so they don't even realize that she is getting this information from them. Let me shift gears and focus a little bit on the things that you value. What are you most proud of these days? What has made you feel a sense of accomplishment? And he says raising his son to go to college and respect the police. And in other words, that the police are under attack by the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. Not feeling like you're a victim, Christopher says, instilling values in my kids and seeing them live their lives, not feeling like they're victims. They're not oppressed. They have a great work ethic. They have greater character traits, all of them. I don't think of a greater thing as a father and as a husband, knowing that we instilled that into our kids. Like, why isn't everybody doing what we're doing? Because that's my idea of how society should be. They're not self-entitled. They believe in the value of work and not the sense of victimization. Yeah, Patrick Healy asks, I want to ask you, each of you, to throw out a word or two on this. What does it mean to be a man? Robert says, provide for your family, compassion, being responsible, being a model for your kids, providing for your family, teaching them right and wrong, having integrity, taking care of your family and being respectful to others, regardless of your personal perspective. And then Robert brings in religion. From my religion standpoint, the man is in charge. The responsibility falls upon a man in certain areas. Now, if something fails, it's the man's responsibility. The man's responsibility and why it failed, not the woman's. Patrick continues. Patrick is not the researcher, but obviously this has really touched a sensitive topic, right? So you see these interaction among these two. This might be interesting in terms of when you do your research, that you interview the two interviewees that you're interviewing, you interview them together and see how they react to each other. Because you can see Robert and Patrick, they're reacting to as much to each other as they are to Anderson, the researcher. Patrick Healy, is masculinity important to you? Christopher, yes. You can't observe the natural animal kingdom and see the separation between masculine and feminine, and then all of a sudden think that we as humans are just going to be all one-noted. We're masculine and feminine for a reason. Patrick Healy, Derek, what about you? Very chill masculinity, not that bravado type of crap, right? I'm not a macho jerk. To me, the stuff that's going on with Ukraine, the president hasn't filled our role as being masculine as a nation in that respect. And that's why Putin is doing what he's doing, because when you don't step up in certain roles, then the stronger person is going to take over. In past times, we've taken a leadership role, and to me, we're not taking a leadership role. And so then Anderson says, okay, well, this obviously this masculinity issue is important for these guys. So then she moves into it herself. She asked the question for the first time about masculinity here. What would you think of as a good example of masculinity or manliness these days? Who's a good example? Danny says Jason Statham, Denzel Washington, yay, Tom Brady. Has the definition of masculinity changed over time? And so on. Patrick asks, not Anderson. Tony, the country's become more feminized. It's not the way it was when I was growing up. Like, in other words, the feminist movement has weakened America. It's somehow tied up with all this crime and breakdown and consensus about what's right and wrong behavior and what we should do in terms of raising our children. Of course, you can't come out and say, I'm a sexist. Yeah, I think women are, you can't say that. So Christopher says, I support feminism, but I don't support modern feminism. I think that modern feminism is focused on so-called toxic masculinity, and they are actual purveyors of man bashing. So I support femininity and feminism, but not to the point where they're looking to hoist themselves above men to try to make up for so-called patriarchy. And I'm going to have to shut down this computer so I can save this file and open up my laptop. Okay, so let me do that right now.